We are happy to have you here, and today you will talk about what do we really know about critical political economist method. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction to the talk, and thank you very much to the invitation to this series of talk. I'm very happy that I can join. And as I just also said, this is also a happy day for me today, because just today my second book was translated in Korean language, and today this second book, what is a commentary to the first two chapters of Capital, appears in Korea. So it's a nice coincidence to give this speech at this day. I announced my talk with the title, What Do We Really Know About Critique of Political Economy's Method? I have at first to restrict a little bit my my theme in two respects. First, I want to talk about Marx's method in Capital, not in this whole project, Critique of Political Economy. What we have to distinguish, I will say some words about this in the following. So it's about the method in Capital, and mainly I will consider the implications of two texts of the introduction from 1857 and the postface to the second German edition from 1873. To all those of you who feel bored by this announcement, because these two texts are discussed so often, I can say I don't want to repeat all the talks we had about these texts. Just the opposite. I want to criticize the usual treatment of these texts and also the usual statements derived from these texts. In order to do this, in my first step, I want to give a brief overview about what I consider necessary when we read the texts of Marx. Marx was a lifelong learning person. He was very reluctant with publishing books. He constantly reworked his texts, and none of his text is meant as a kind of final result or final contribution to an issue. Marx's texts were steps in an ongoing process of his intellectual and scientific development. And furthermore, all his texts, also the very theoretical texts, were always interventions in current struggles and discussions. His texts were not meant as a kind of timeless contribution to an eternal discussion. His texts were meant as interventions. And when we read Marx's texts, we have to take into account both sides, that they are steps in the ongoing learning process of Marx and that they are interventions in discussions. So we shouldn't treat them as timeless contributions. We shouldn't try to put them together to get a kind of coherent Marxist view. The opposite, we have to see each text as well in a diachronic dimension as in a synchronic dimension. With the diachronic dimension, I mean we have to put each text in the in the course of Marx's intellectual and scientific development, we have to see which insights Marx already had reached when he wrote this text and which insights he didn't reach when he wrote this text. With the synchronic dimension, I mean we have to see to which struggles and discussions a certain text replies. We have to investigate for each text the scientific and political context and to see which role this text plays in this context. So, when we discuss these two famous texts, Introduction of 1857 and the Postface of 1873, we have to look for each of these texts for the diachronic and the synchronic dimension. And this is the main task I put here in this talk today. So first, I will discuss Introduction of 1857. This introduction is very famous for its section on method and the famous sentence about the ascension from the abstract to the concrete. I have the feeling nearly no interpreter wants to miss this ascension. It must be quoted at least one time, very often more than one time. And it is claimed that this is one of the central keys to understand the method also in Capital. This claim is justified, mostly implicitly, sometimes also explicitly, by a twofold assumption. The first assumption is that it is claimed Introduction, the text of August, written in August 1857, is the introduction to Grundrisse, the manuscripts written in winter 57-58. And the second claim is that Grundrisse is the first draft of Capital. Both claims I want to reject. I want to give some arguments that both claims are wrong. Introduction is not the introduction to Grundrisse, and Grundrisse is not the first draft of Capital. So why introduction is not the introduction to Grundrisse? When you look to the manuscript of Grundrisse, you will see it is not at all a planned and designed book. It starts commenting the French author Alfred Darimont, a pupil of Proudhon. Commenting Darimont, Marx came to more and more fundamental questions about commodity and money, and he follows these fundamental questions until he even reaches Capital. So Grundrisse is a book, or is a draft without beginning. It begins with something totally else. It begins with an excerpt, like we have the many notebooks of Marx, where he's doing excerpts of different authors. And only then, slowly and smoothly, it becomes a research manuscript, but it is not planned, it is not designed, and insofar it also cannot have an introduction. Introduction is really a different kind of text than Grundrisse, and when Marx wrote Introduction, he didn't know that he wrote this Grundrisse manuscript. As we know, Marx felt the pressure to finally write such a draft in front of the economic crisis in the year 57-58. He believed that this crisis will shake capitalism very considerably, that new revolution developments will come. And he wanted to present his analysis for these revolutionary movements. This was then in winters 57, 58, his motivation to start writing. In August 57, the situation was completely different. And I will explain later why or what the text of introduction meant in this diachronical perspective, looking to what happened before 57 in Marx's intellectual development. Now I just want very briefly to criticize the second claim with which the importance of introduction for capital is justified, the claim that Grundrisse is already a draft, a first draft for capital. Working on Grundrisse, Marx developed step by step his famous 6-book plan, which was announced in the preface of a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy in 1859. The first book of this 6-book plan should deal with capital. But this first book of the 6-book plan is not at all identical with the later plan of a 4-volume capital, a plan which was designed since 1863, so some years later. The presentation in Grundrisse and also in the following manuscript from 1861 to 63 was guided by the opposition of capital in general and the many capitals in competition. Capital in general was not just a name for a general level of presentation, it had a very distinct methodological meaning regarding scope and level of abstraction. Regarding scope, in capital in general, all the features which appear in competition should be presented in a kind of logical order. And the level of presentation of capital in general should be the abstraction from all particular and single capitals. So a certain content should be presented on a certain level of abstraction. In the manuscript Marx wrote in between 1861 and 63, he had to learn that this double claim couldn't be fulfilled. And after summer 1863, the notion capital in general never is used by Marx, never in manuscripts, never in letters or even publications. What then emerged as capital is methodologically very different. It is different from scope. It is not restricted to the old book capital of the 6-book plan. No, it also includes the main themes on the 2nd book of landed property and the 3rd book of wage labor. But even more important than this extension of scope, it is the methodological structure is not anymore oriented in the opposition of capital in general and competition of the many capitals. It is oriented to the opposition between individual capital and total social capital. But this division is not only treated one time, it is treated on different levels of abstraction, the level of production, of circulation, and of the process as a whole, the level of each of the three books of Capital. So we have really, I cannot go here in detail, the time is too short for it, but what I wanted to stress here is that the methodological structure of Capital, of the four-volume plan of Capital, is rather different from Grundrisse and from the manuscript of 61-63, and that this new methodological structure of Capital was far ahead when Marx wrote Introduction. And insofar, it is very limited what we can learn from Introduction of 57 about Capital, which starts in 1863, 6 years later. But now I want to come to Introduction itself, and I want to discuss what kind of text is Introduction. Marx's methodological consideration didn't originate in abstract reflections. They were always a result of his scientific practice. They emerged ex post and not ex ante. Therefore, when we want to understand what Introduction is, we have to look to the scientific practice of Marx, which is before Introduction. Marx himself, in the preface of a contribution to the critique of political economy from 1859, stresses that his arrival in London marked a new start in his economic research process. In London, he found the big British library, the biggest collection of economic literature in these times, a lot of economic newspapers and journals. And for the first time, Marx could study the classical English economists really in English. Before, he didn't know English. He had to use bad French translations of Smith and Ricardo. In the early 1850s, the so-called London notebooks emerged, where Marx collected masses of economic literature, doing excerpts from this literature, but already started with small essays. One of these essays, called Reflection, has survived. It is published in Mega. Another essay, which Marx mentions in Grundrisse, his remarks on economy, and he quotes, or he gives a hint to page 35 of this manuscript, what means it must have a considerable length. These remarks on economy, unfortunately, didn't survive. But we know from this, Marx did excerpts and already started with his own designs, with his own drafts. And this, in my view, is the background for the diachronic dimension of Introduction. It is the last essay in this preparatory period, which lasts from 1850 to 1857. So it is not the prescription of later writings. Introduction tries to fix the results from the period, from the past period of 1850 and to 1857. Regarding the synchronic dimension of Introduction, it intervenes in the debates of economists, but not only contemporary economists, but even the older authors, Adam Smith, James Mill, David Ricardo, and so on. I count these older authors who were already dead, nevertheless, to the synchronic dimension of introduction, because these authors were in some respect the discussion partners of Marx in his library life, and in so far I think this is the synchronic dimension. When we have this in mind, we can understand what ascension from the abstract to the concrete really mean. Marx didn't announce this as something specific for his own method. He mentions this famous ascension as the scientific method in economy. It is what he learned from discussing several and different approaches of bourgeois economists, of economics. So the famous formulation, ascension from the abstract to the concrete, tells us really nothing about Marx's own method. It just fixes what he can find in Smith or Ricardo, where they start with value, then they come to money, and then to capital, to lend it rent, and so on. In August 1857, Marx was not really able to tell us very much about his own methodological approach, because he didn't yet really start with his own presentation, besides the small drafts I just mentioned. But nevertheless, we can still learn something from the introduction, which has nothing to do with, it also has to do with this ascension from abstract to the concrete, but in a very different way than this ascension is usually used. It is used as a guideline, but as a guideline, it is misleading, because it presupposes we already know what is the abstract and what is the concrete. But Marx had to learn this. When we look to the Grundrisse manuscript, we see at the very end that Marx makes a new start. A new section is titled with first value. This section stops after 1.5 pages, and it is not continued. A contribution to the critique of political economy from 1859 didn't start with first value, it starts with commodity. Commodity, as Marx says later in his notes on Wagner, is the most concrete issue in economics. Insofar, Marx didn't start with the most abstract, he started with the most concrete and derives only an abstract category from this. However, the commodity with which he starts is not the really concrete commodity we see every day when we go shopping. The everyday commodity has a money price. But in the development of categories, Marx, when dealing with the commodity, he couldn't presuppose from the first sentence on the existence of money. So the commodity with which he starts is a kind of abstract commodity. It is a commodity which has an exchange value, but not a price. It can receive a price only when we have the category of money, and this category didn't exist on the very first level of the presentation. Insofar, I mentioned all this just to make clear that we cannot presuppose that it is clear from the beginning what is the abstract, what is the concrete, and we have to start with the abstract. No, what is abstract, what is concrete is a task for inquiry. And when Marx wrote Introduction, he didn't have done this inquiry. Insofar, I don't think that this famous ascension from abstract to the concrete is really helpful in understanding capital. However, I think there is another point in Introduction who is helpful for us. In Introduction, Marx sketches very, very roughly a kind of empirical science, rests on empirical research, but without the illusions of empiricism. With illusions of empiricism, I mean the idea that empirical data are sufficient for understanding something, for understanding capitalism, and that philosophical considerations are superfluous. Such a kind of empiricism we can find in the Feuerbach manuscripts of German ideology. There, Marx stressed very much what we need is a positive science, a science which just states what is, people exist, humans exist, they have to eat, they have to produce food, and so on. We just have to make such statements, and all these philosophical ideas only express that the philosophers are far away from real world. Philosophy in German ideology is a bad word, something which Marx want to put a demarcation line against it. In Introduction from 1857, Marx mentions that the concrete totality we have to regard as a conceptual totality, as a result of mental processes. It is a result of thinking. It is filled with empirical knowledge, of course, but it is filled with thinking, with abstract categories and considerations. So we see very embryonic, just as a hint, the necessity of an empirical science beyond empiricism, an empirical science which rests on theoretical considerations, theoretical categories. And for these theoretical categories, Marx makes the statement, also in Introduction, that the order in which we have to present the categories cannot follow the historical development. It has to follow the connection of the categories in the present society. So we cannot just do an analysis by a kind of historical empiricism, just to follow the historical development. We have to solve the theoretical question how the categories, the economic categories, relate to each other in the developed capitalist society. And Marx was just at the beginning of this task in 1857. Remarkable for the introduction, and this is my last remark about it, is also that dialectics is not mentioned. Neither Marx dialectics nor a reverse dialectics used by neither Hegel dialectics is mentioned, nor Marx dialectics as a kind of reversed Hegel dialectics. This is not at all an issue in introduction of 1857, and it is for us clear why it is an issue, why it was not an issue. Marx occupied a second time with Hegel only since the year 1858, a few months after introduction, when his friend Freilichgrad sent him some books from Hegel, which he found in the papers of Bakunin, that Marx could use these books. And as we know from the letters of Marx, he was very thankful for this present. And he said that reading again Hegel's logic was helpful for his presentation. So the development, how to use dialectics, how not to use dialectics, the intensive consideration of this started only after introduction. So now I finish with introduction and I come to the second main text I want here to discuss, the postface of 1873, the postface of the second German edition. Regarding the diachronic dimension of this postface, we see a completely different situation compared with introduction. Marx was doing his own presentations since late 1857, and since 1863 he was preparing Capital. So the postface is really in the middle of Marx's own attempts to do a presentation of his approach. And insofar we could expect that it is on a much higher level discussing methodological questions than it was introduction. However, we have to see also what is the synchronic dimension of the postface. And this synchronic dimension, I think, at least in my view, gives reason to understand that postface is definitely not an essay on method. What is the context of this synchronic dimension of the postface? In order to understand this, we have to look to the reception of volume 1 of Capital, which appeared in 1867, just 6 years before the postface. Marx had high expectations. He expected, on the one hand, that Capital, the book Capital, would be a big success, as well as a political success discussing capitalism, as well as a private success, that the income he hoped to get from this book will release his financial problems. However, he was disappointed in both aspects. The 1,000 copies of the first edition of volume 1 needed nearly more than 4 years to be sold. This is also in these times not very much. 1,000 copies in more than for years. A real discussion of the book didn't take place. Most bourgeois German journals didn't review the book. In the postface, Marx mentions that the book at least was discussed, was received among workers. But this is not really the case. The book had some reviews in the working class press, mostly written by friends of Marx, but there is no evidence that the book was really read by many workers. We have, contrarily, some evidence that this was rather unlikely. The price of the book was very high. The price equals approximately the weekly salary of a skilled worker. So the workers just couldn't afford the book. And when they read, when by some accidents they could have access to the book was a very hard challenge. In contemporary editions of Capital, all the quotes from foreign languages are translated, but this was not the case in the first edition. There were 5 different languages besides German present. This was also a big challenge for an educated bourgeois, but it was more a much higher challenge for the workers who in this time had only elementary, most of them visited elementary schools. The book had a lot of hints to mythological names, to figures of world literature. All this nowadays in most editions is explained. This was not the case in the first edition. So it was definitely not a book for the workers, and the workers didn't really occupy with this book. That Marx wrote in the preface, the book had success among workers, I think it was a kind of embellishment, a kind of window dressing for his book. The postface, the content of the postface, in my view, was mainly a defensive act. Marx had to defend his book against several attacks. As I mentioned, a detailed critique of the content of his book didn't happen. When it was reviewed, in most cases, the bourgeois reviewer of the book remained on a rather general level, criticizing the method of Capital. And the method for most of these reviewers was Hegelian, because Hegel was mentioned. And now we have to take into account that in the year 1867, the zeitgeist, the ruling opinions, were clearly anti-Hegelian. To say a book follows an Hegelian method meant this book is totally old-fashioned. This book has absolutely nothing to say about the present time. To say it is Hegelian was a kind of killing attack on a book in these times. And now Marx tries to defend against this killing attack. And what he wrote there in the postface, I think we have to see in front of this attempt to defend against this killing argument. When we read the postface, we see Marx starts with a rather superficial defense of dialectics. He gives a very long quote. I think it's more than a page in most editions. A quote from a Russian reviewer who described Marx's approach in a rather friendly way as following the historical development of the object. Marx tries to identify the laws of the development of the object. He shows how the object develops according to such rules and not according to the intentions of the acting humans. And this Marx comments, what else did this reviewer describe as the dialectical method? So when we take this literally, dialectics or dialectical method just means to follow the historical development of something. This is a rather vague and also, I think, a rather poor determination of dialectics. The only advantage of this vague and poor description of dialectics is to show to the public that dialectics is not at all something mysterious or metaphysical, what was in the public opinion combined with Hegelian philosophy, its mysterious metaphysics. No, dialectics is something rather normal, which stands on the ground of normal reasoning. I think this was just the intention of Marx to present such a poor picture of dialectics, to show, look, this is not at all a problem when I use dialectics. However, Marx didn't stand at this point. He also tries to describe his personal relation to the philosophy of Hegel. This personal stance is double-sided. On the one hand, Marx says he is a disciple of Hegel. He learned a lot from Hegel, but on the other side, he has critique in Hegel. He's not a follower of Hegel. This double-sided stance of Marx is already very simply expressed in the so-called manuscript 2 for Capital Volumes 2. This manuscript 2 was written by Marx, or he started to write it in 1868, just after Volume 1 was published. Meanwhile, manuscript 2 is published in Mega, and there on page 32, we can read a very simple description of Marx's relation to Hegel. In the postface, he adds to this simple description that on the one hand, he is a disciple, but nevertheless, he is also a critic of Hegel. In the postface, Marx adds all these metaphorical phrases which are quoted again and again. Marx says in the postface, his dialectic is the exactly opposite to Hegel's dialectic. Hegel transformed the idea in an independent subject, while with him, with Marx, the ideal is just the transformed material, the material transformed in mind. To say simply Hegel made the idea an independent subject, I think it is rather superficial. Maybe it fits to the idealism of George Berkeley, or maybe to the idealism of Fichte, but with Hegel, the case is a little bit more complicated. And I think also Marx knew this. But a postface is not the place for an essay about Hegel. So he just mentioned this accusation against Hegel in order to make clear to the public, look, I am not a traditional Hegelian. This is okay, but what is not okay when we nowadays use such phrases as if they emerge from a kind of eternal wisdom about the relation Marx and Hegel. So these usual metaphorical phrases about the dialectics is standing on its head, it has to be reversed, there is not really a content. Marx uses these phrases to put a kind of demarcation point, but what is really the demarcation line, but what are the contents which are demarcated? It becomes not clear from such phrases. And insofar, they are not at all helpful to understand very much in Capital. Nevertheless, I think also in the postface, there is something what is useful, what we should take into account. And this is the well-known distinction between the mode of inquiry and the mode of presentation. It is only a short paragraph in the postface, but I think it is important. Nevertheless, in the first view, it seems to be a banality. Every student in the first year knows that first he has to do some inquiry to find the connections between different aspects, and then the student has to think how I can present my results. So in some respect, this distinction, inquiry and presentation, is just a banality. Reading Capital, it becomes less banal. Why? Presentation for Marx has a rather emphatic meaning. Presentation is not just to do a performance or to order the things in a way that you can understand them easily. Presentation for Marx is not something what happens arbitrarily. It is nothing where you have a subjective choice to do it so or to do it otherwise. Presentation, as we already saw in the introduction, in this last remark I told you, presentation has to present the categories in an order which reflects the relations of the economic conditions inside the developed capitalist society. Insofar, there is not only a good or a bad presentation, like many authors would say. For Marx, there is really the much stronger case of a correct or a not correct presentation. Presentation is not something of taste. Presentation has to do with truth, with the way how to catch the object you want to present. And insofar, presentation and inquiry is not totally opposed. A main issue of inquiry is to find the correct presentation. And this, I think, is also the reason why in many manuscripts of Marx, presentation or the attempt to present transforms in inquiry. Marx tried, excuse me, Marx tries to present something. He realizes that his presentation has some shortcoming, and then the research process started, not the research process looking for empirical data, but the research process about the correct presentation. So in many manuscripts for Capital, we see this transformation, this reversion, where the process of presentation transforms in a process of inquiry about the correct presentation. This we have to have in mind when we read these manuscripts. We always have to ask on which level we are. Are we on the level of presentation? Are we on the, or we are on the level of the inquiry of the presentation? This is a big difference, these two levels. So this is an important hint, I think, we can take from the post phase, but not all the method, the metaphorical phrases we find there and which are quoted so often. So now at the end of this presentation, I want to do some more general remarks about method in Capital. What I showed until now, or what I tried to show until now, was that these famous texts, Introduction and Postface of the second edition, tell us much less about method than it is usually assumed. And what they tell us is, in my view, something else than that what is usually said. When we want to learn about method in Capital, I think we cannot look for the final essay on method. Why? Marx didn't first develop a method as a kind of prescription and then follow this method. His methodological attempts followed a kind of learning by doing. And he was open-minded enough to understand that there is not just one method to follow, but there are different methods for different problems. In Capital, when we read Capital cautiously, we will not find the method. We will find a variety of methods and a combination of different methods fitting to different kind of problems. We will find in Capital that Marx is doing an empirical science filled using a lot of empirical information, but without the illusions of empiricism, that you just have to use these empirical data and that this is the only or the main task of science. As the preface of the first volume states, central for Marx is the theoretical development. And he wants to present this theoretical development, and he stresses in the preface of 1867 that the English capitalism is only the illustration of this theoretical development. Theoretical development of the categories in earlier manuscripts, Marx also called the dialectical development of categories. So dialectics in Capital is a conceptual method, a conceptual approach. But as Marx stressed in the so-called Urtext, or in English, the outlines of Critique of Political Economy, what he wrote in 1858, a draft for the contribution, which appeared in 59. In this draft, Marx mentioned the dialectical presentation has to know its limits. It only stays correct when it knows about its limits. And the limits are exactly the point where the pure conceptual relation of categories is not anymore enough, and historical analysis has to start. So in Capital, we can find a lot of historical analysis, historical development, and also analysis of contemporary processes. But this historical knowledge is clearly subordinated to the theoretical development. It comes not in order to say, oh yes, capitalism is something historical, now let's look the historical development. No, it comes into the presentation at some well-defined points. So the theoretical development, the dialectical development has limits, but nevertheless, it also limits the historical presentation in Capital. To discuss all this more detailed, we have to look in Marx texts. We cannot imagine this from any methods about, from any essays about method. We can only learn, like Marx did it, by analyzing his own presentation. And this is a task I just can mention here, but I cannot do it in this talk. But I hope I could give some ideas in which way we can do this, or in which way we have to discuss this. And with this point, I want to finish, and I thank you very much for the attention to my to this presentation. And now I'm very curious about questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your great talk. It was very interesting. Yes. I think that there will be some questions. Is there anybody with questions? 상원, 상원 한상원?
He's mute. Sangwon Han is mute. You must open the micro for him.
Should I do something? I don't know.
The administrator.
I can open the mic. I will open the mic. He open now. And
oh yes. Okay, Michael, it's very nice to see you. And it was a great talk, very interesting. My question is about my question is something else. My question is about your opinion to Jacques Bidet, because Jacques Bidet's capital interpretations are now published in Korea, and it's like very popular. And he is steadily attacking German tradition of value theory. He is not mentioning you, Michael. I don't know why. I hope he also mentioned you, but he criticizes Backhaus, Reichelt, Robert Kurz, and Moshe Poston. And his critique is the main contradiction of capitalism is not between use value and value, but use value and surplus value. And this is a political contradiction of capitalism, and he interprets expenditure of human labor power, Verausgabung der menschlichen Arbeitskraft, as a biopolitical critique of capitalism, and so he combines Marx with Foucault. So I think this is interesting. This is very interesting interpretation of Jacques Bidet, and nowadays this kind of expansion is important, but it may have also dangers. So I want to hear from you, your opinion, and maybe your criticism of Jacques Bidet. Thank you.
Okay, this now is a little bit difficult. It's a completely different issue than what was the issue today. So I will do this very briefly. Maybe there is another opinion to talk about Bidet. I know him since many years, and I also estimate him very much. He translated also some texts from me in French. I have, on the one hand, I have differences with Backhaus, Reichelt, Poston, persons he criticized. I also have some critics against him, but also I have basic critics about Bidet. I think what I stress, or not only I, this is the common thing with Backhaus and maybe also Poston, what we stress is the form aspect of the economic categories of capitalism, that we have to see value as a certain form. And I think Bidet underestimates this form aspect. He brings in a dimension which is, I don't want to deny it completely when you mention use value versus surplus value, but I think this dimension is posited on a different level than Bidet brings it in. He makes an important problem. I don't want to deny this, but he poses the problem, which is important, in the wrong context. And this disturbs the whole picture. Insofar, with Bidet, I criticize basically his approach. Nevertheless, I think he produced a lot of valuable single ideas we should discuss and we should use in a different framework.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question I can see right now?
Ori?
Oh, so my question, I think, is too general for right now. I think there are questions more related to the talk today in the chat, and I'll wait for my turn after they're addressed.
Yeah, I see there are certain questions in the chat, but it's for me a little bit difficult to follow you and reading at the same time the chat. Perhaps some persons who put questions in the chat could give these questions for all of us here, and then I can more easy answer to them.
Did we see all of the participants? So,
excuse me. Now I must for a break for 1 second. Someone is ringing my doorbell. This is the disadvantage doing this at home. In 1 second, I'm back.
okay.
So now I'm back. Are there any questions now?
Yes. Actually, I wrote my questions in the chat. So may I read it again? So I think, yeah, this is my question. In 1857 introduction, Marx said that the ascension from the abstract to the concrete should be preceded by the descension from the concrete to the abstract. That is, I think, a kind of empirical or inquiry work. Although Marx said that the ascension from the abstract to the concrete is obviously scientifically correct method. What do you think about this? This is my first question. And second, can we regard the core essence of the method of presentation in 1873 first phase broadly same as the method of the ascension from the abstract to the concrete in 1857 introduction? We may also regard the method of inquiry same as the descension from the concrete to the abstract. If so, I think, yeah, we can say that there is not so big difference between two Marx texts regarding the method. What do you think?
Your first question, I tried already to answer in my presentation, that this ascension, the ascension Marx speaks about, it is a statement, as you also quoted, about the scientific method. It is not a statement of Marx' specific method. It is a very general statement, what he gained by his study of classical political economy. And then I try to show that his real treatment of abstract and concrete is much more complicated than this sentence insinuates. What is the abstract? What is the concrete is not at all clear. And with what he starts, when he starts with the commodity, is not the abstract. So I would deny that from this sentence, ascension from the abstract to the concrete, we really can learn anything about Marx's really used method. To your second question, the method of inquiry, I think we cannot describe it as the way from the concrete to the abstract. The method of inquiry includes various moments. It includes dealing with statistical data. Here, maybe you can say some concrete data, we have to rely to more abstract categories. But in the inquiry, we have also to do much more. As Marx says in this quote, we have to find the inner connection of the object. And this, to find this inner connection, I have not in mind the English translation in German, das innere Band des Stoffes. This inner connection is reflected in the presentation of the categories. Insofar, I stressed inquiry, one big issue of inquiry is presentation. It is not just inquiry is separated from presentation. Inquiry studies presentation. Presentation itself come to its limits, and then a new inquiry in the way of presentation has to start. So I think also here the relation is much more complicated than to say from concrete to the abstract is inquiry, and then from the abstract to the concrete is presentation. No, this is a very big simplification to say it in this way. And insofar, I think what Marx is doing is really not reflected in a good way in these ascensions from abstract to concrete, or descension from concrete to abstract.
Okay, any other questions?
Philip Vesco, can you talk? Can you lead your question?
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Michael, for your talk. I was wondering a bit, what's your assessment about Postone's claim that the presentation in Capital constitutes the argument itself, that it's the unfolding of the categories that covers its tracks as it unfolds, and that constitutes the kind of, let's say, its own proof. I think regarding the thing Marx says about it will seem as you have an a priori construction. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think the argument of Postone, I would say, is an exaggeration. I would accept that the presentation, the way of presentation, is a part of the proof. But as I stated at the beginning, Marx is doing an empirical science without being trapped by empiricism. And insofar, it is not enough to follow the presentation and to say, yes, the way of presentation is already a proof of the truth of presentation. No, here we have to really to think on this remark of Marx, that the dialectical presentation only is correct when it knows its limits. And insofar, you need more methods, and insofar also more ways to prove that you are correct. In some respect, I would say this claim of Postone is going in the direction of a kind of idealistic exaggeration.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I hear you.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for another great talk. I was recently reading a book by I think a former student of yours called Clara Ramas, San Miguel, and on fetishism and mystification, which I thought was great. But I also found in the book that there was a postface to her book by, I think, one of her tutors, or one of her other directors, and this tutor has just recently published a book about the 1857 introduction from a kind of Althusserian point of view. I'm just wondering whether it's possible, whether you could describe a little bit about why it seems to have been so important for Althusserian readings, or for Althusser, this particular fragment.
Okay, here I must say I don't know this book which you mentioned about the introduction. I know that Althusser briefly in Lire le Capital mentioned the introduction. He tried to put it in his structuralist view, and in so far, of course, Althusserians today will rely to the introduction. But the special book you mentioned by one of the tutors of Clara, I don't know. It's also the problem. I don't read Spanish. With Clara, I could discuss her discussion in her dissertation in German. She speaks and reads very nicely German, but I'm unable, unfortunately, to read Spanish.
Sure, thanks.
Hi, Michael. I'm Michelle Henley. Yeah, thank you very much for your great talk. I am Mia Son, who visited you several years ago in Berlin. Yeah, can you remember me? Yeah, I have one question. I would like to ask you how Marx see the women's situation. The feminists argued that Marx did not consider the woman's labor as a value labor. So I just want to know why then Marx didn't consider about women's labor as a value labor. So I just want to know how Marx consider the woman as how the woman's labor valuable or not. Yeah.
Marx and women's labor, when I understood correctly, is your issue.
Yeah.
When we study Capital, we will find not very much about women's labor. There are some statements which are important. For example, in the chapter on machinery and big industry, he also deals with women coming in industry as workers and the consequences for homework, that now a lot of homework cannot anymore done at home. The products must be bought and the restructuring. So there are some strengths, but I must say it was not at all a big issue in Marx. Nevertheless, when you look to the whole writings of Marx and also Engels, you can find something about women and women's work. There is even a nice book of Heather Brown where she tried to collect all the the statements about women's work. Nevertheless, I think it would be wrong now to try to present Marx as the first feminist. This he was definitely not. The interesting question today is, in my view, in how far can modern discourses about feminism, about women's work in the house, in the fabric, in how far they are compatible with Marx's analysis. That Marx missed mainly women's labor, is this really a theoretical gap, that his approach has no space for such a question? Or is it more or less a personal gap, that the person Marx didn't occupy with these questions, but nevertheless the theoretical approach gives space for it? And my view tends to the last alternative. Marx himself was not very conscious about women and women's work, but his approach allows us to include at least a big part of the modern discourses about women's work.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I'll assume I can ask my question now. So
Sorry, Master is first.
Sure.
Master, are you have a question?
No, I didn't have a question. I think I just made a comment, so that's probably, I'm sure you've all read the comment, so I don't need to repeat it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so hi, Mihail. Very nice talk. So my general question would be, because there's a huge engagement with the philosopher Etienne Balibar in South Korea, I also wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts on it, because I do recall that the two of you met at discussing Marx's Capital after 100 years in Athens, Greece. So, but I don't think I recall ever seeing you cite and discuss his work, but I do think there are a lot of, I guess, a similar problematic in that Balibar's central thesis regarding Marx's mature works is that he, in the strong sense, unfinished Capital. So it's open to interpretation there, and then also the various Marx, following Althusser, Marxism is constituted by its disagreements. So we have to develop a Marxism more adequate to the conjuncture we find ourselves in. I do think that the specific theses or arguments within how to build up those combinations might differ, but I thought those were very compatible theses. And even in the Heinrich Twitter, I haven't seen people discuss Balibar much, so I wanted to ask the man himself, what do you think about Balibar?
Okay, this is again a very general question. Balibar, he had a very remarkable development. I still think his work together with Althusser, Lire le Capital, it is a seminal work, no matter that there are also a lot of criticism. But I think it was really important, even in its shortcomings, because it also pointed out the shortcoming of certain discussions in these times. After this, Balibar developed in many ways. So it's a little bit difficult for me to give just a general estimation of him. I met him, I think, not only in Athens, also in other opportunities. And of course, there is a certain similarity that we both stress openness. And I would not only say openness in Marxism. As you perhaps know, I like also to quote very often this nice sentence from Marx to his son-in-law: "Je ne suis pas Marxiste," I am not a Marxist. And I think that this is not just a phrase. In the notes on Wagner, Marx also said, I never formulated a socialist system. Wagner said, value theory is the cornerstone of Marx's socialist system. And Marx noted, I never formulated a socialist system. So Marx was very suspicious against isms about systems and so on. And I think this anti-systemic stand, in this I feel very close to Balibar and others. But of course, this alone is not an answer to something. You then must discuss, okay, what then? What do we have? And then we are at certain problems, how to discuss the current capitalism, how to discuss the political shifts we see and so on. But okay, this is such a broad discussion. I cannot answer this now in just a few sentences.
Thank you. Professor Hyun-Kang, can you discuss the presentation?
The talk was very clear. I don't have that much questions, but I found it very interesting that you interpret Marx as a very open theoretical, and the Capital is not the Bible, it's not an absolute book, it's rather an open book, it's a description of an ongoing project, it's not a final book. I thought this kind of knowledge is very helpful for us, because the Marxism was in the past had a very orthodox value, and many people thought it is the truth in itself, but even Marx doesn't believe in the truth in itself. But I have the feeling maybe he doesn't believe in the truth, in the objective truth, but he believes in a kind of truth.
Yeah,
what do you think about the truth concept of Marx?
Yeah, I think he believed in truth, and he searched for truth. It is not to say, okay, anything goes. This was not at all Marx's position. But he was very critical against his own writings, against his own results. Why do we have today so many manuscripts of Marx? Because he was so reluctant to publish something. He always thought, oh, no, it's not ready. It's not, no, this I cannot do. And I also have to consider this and that. It's not ready. So his treatment of his own texts is completely different from the treatment many Marxists have with this text, that they think every note Marx left is the expression of a kind of eternal truth. Marx knew very well that he is in an ongoing research process. When you think in the preface of Capital from 1867, at the end, he wrote, I say it in German before I try to translate, jedes Urteil wissenschaftlicher Kritik ist mir willkommen. Every judgment of a scientific critique is welcome. And this was not a kind of arrogant statement. Okay, come with your critique, I'm better than you. Not at all. He knew he just contributed something to this infinite process of research, and others will criticize this. Others will also find some weak points, and then he was ready to deal with his own weak points to change things. And this we can see already in the second edition of Capital. He changed a lot of points where he received critique, mainly from Engels and from Kugelmann. And he didn't manage to prepare a third edition, but he had some ideas. And he wanted, as we know from his late letters, a fundamental rework, not only of his manuscripts of volume 2 and 3, but also of volume 1. In the late 1881, his wife just had died in December 81. Marx received a letter from his publisher that now the second edition is nearly outsold and he should think about what he will change for the third edition. And Marx wrote to Danielson, the Russian translator, probably I will tell the publisher to make only a small new edition, not very much copies. I will change only a few points. And then for the fourth edition, I will do a big reworking of volume 1. So he himself didn't see volume 1 as a final result. It is a step in an ongoing process. And when we see his letters, what he wanted to change in volume 1, I think it was not a few empirical data to have the newest crisis as an example instead of an older crisis. No, there were also theoretical problems he wanted to touch. He wanted to solve or to present in a better way in this reworking of volume 1. And in so far, none of his writings is really the last word about something. It is a step in a process. And in order to understand this step, we must look on the process. And exactly this I try to do with my distinction between the diachronic dimension, a text in the line of development of Marx, and the synchronic dimension, a text as an intervention in discussions and struggles. And only by combining these two dimensions, I think we can make a good use of the texts of Marx. But also, this is a discussing process. Also, when I present you something about introduction and postface, I don't think this is the last word one can say. In the contrary, I hope to find critics. I hope that the critics can identify some weak points in my considerations, and then we can go together forward to a better understanding.
Yes, yes, it is clear that Marx thinks that no theory can have the last word, of course. There is an interconnection between the theoretical and empirical process. There is no absolute theory, but I have the feeling he has, on the other hand, the belief in the certain direction of historical development. On the other hand, he thinks that there can be no theoretical construction which can describe the objective reality. But on the other hand, he believes in the objective true development of the history. I see between both, I see a paradox. What do you think about it?
I think here we have to see also the line of development in the thoughts of Marx. In the 1840s, when we read Communist Manifesto, there is, I think, a clear historical determinism. Mm-hmm. There is a historical road which there is no other alternative. Also in the 1850s, this historical determinism led Marx to a certain Eurocentrism. There is the European road, and therefore, for example, the British colonies in India, they are treated very badly, but this colonial history is the only chance of development for them. With the uprisal in India in 1857, this Eurocentrism started to change. And also the historical determinism started to change. And when we now jump in the late 1870s, where Marx was questioned by Vera Zasulich, do Russia has to copy the development of Western Europe, or is there another possibility? Marx accepted that there is another possibility, that there is not only one trace in history. And even in his letter to this Russian journal, I don't know Russian, so I cannot pronounce the complicated Russian name of this journal, but probably you know which letter I mean. There he also made a very fundamental statement against any history of philosophy of history. That such a philosophy of history cannot really serve us in any way. It promises a key to everything, but such a key doesn't exist. So in the late 1870s, I think we can find in Marx clear statements against any historical determinism. This had consequences. I mentioned already his plans to rework capital. From the late 70s, there exists a notebook which until now is only published in small parts, where Marx is doing excerpts from a leading German historian, Schlosser. And the interesting is what he is doing, what kind of excerption he is doing. It is about late Middle Ages, the history of towns in northern Italy, in Germany. And I can only speculate But my speculation, my proposal is that Marx, in these historical studies in the works of Schlosser, he tried to extend his analysis of the so-called primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation in capital is oriented at the English way, what happened in England. And perhaps for reworking capital, he wants to extend this. I have not a clear evidence for this, so it's really a speculation I do, but I think it's rather plausible. In another case, we know this in the manuscript for volume 3 of Capital, which was written in the year 1864 to 65. There is a big section on grounded rent. And it takes its example from England, of course. In the 1870s, Marx did extensive studies about landed property in Russia. And Marx was very clear that the way to transform landed property in Russia in capitalist property is rather different from England. And also the way in the United States is rather different. And he had the ideas in the new third volume to combine what happened in Russia and what happened in United States. So his historical scope became bigger and bigger in the 70s. Unfortunately, in my view, this is also one reason why he couldn't finish with Capital. The design of Capital in the 1870s changed considerably. Indeed, what he had in mind in the 70s, I would say it was not possible to realize by a single person. What he designed in the 70s, it would needed a research institute with 20 or 30 researchers and 20 years of research time. It was not possible for Marx alone, and I think even if he would have lived 10 years more with a very good health, he wouldn't finish Capital because the scope was so extended. And this, I think, is the living contradiction, what you mentioned, that he's open in his scientific approaches. He's very open-minded. This open-mindedness led him to overcome his former determinism. He saw the necessity of a much bigger scientific approach, but it was impossible to realize it by himself. And in this time, I also must say, he didn't have really partners or pupils who could do the job. He was a very lonesome cowboy in the field of theory in the 80s and in the 70s and early 80s. So he tried the impossible, but he didn't manage to do the impossible.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Okay.
I think two persons gave sign, Marcel and Jin Yong Chong.
Sign.
And they are both mute. Someone must let them talk.
Ah, okay. All right.
Okay. Because do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay. My name is Jin Young. I want to say hello, Viga Tessinen. Do you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I hear you.
Okay. Just hello. Did you get
Hello.
Coronavirus vaccination in Germany?
If I have a vaccination?
Yeah, coronavirus vaccination. Did you get it?
No, not until
No,
now.
not at all. Okay.
I'm too young.
Oh, you too young.
In Germany,
Okay.
it starts with the
Okay.
persons older than
Okay. Okay, you look very healthy. Anyway, thank you so much. And I'm a first year Hyun-Kang University graduate school Department of Political Economy student. Now, today you really gave me a very good insight to understand, actually better understanding how to read Marx works, and especially the capital you are talking about, and really appreciate, very clear to me, you mentioned about synchronic dimension and diachronic dimension. To my understanding, it also, you imply with these two methods, you suggesting not really method, but it's kind of a tools effectively to understand Marx works. I saw that since a couple of months ago, Monthly Review Press, you have a new book will be coming, how to read let me see. Yeah, how to read a Marx Capital, commentary and explanation on the beginning chapters. May I ask you, did you touch any part of today's presentation, diachronic and synchronic dimension in this new coming book from Monthly Review Press?
No.
Oh,
This
no.
book, as the title is a commentary. I take the text of Capital, and to each paragraph, I give a commentary.
Okay.
There are sometimes a few diachronic or synchronic elements mentioned, but I don't do this systematically. What I did today, it was more a discussion on method, but in this book, it is a detailed commentary. And this book, what will come in August in yes. United States, you have already in Korean translation, it appeared today. How to read Capital.
Is the same book?
Yeah, it is the first part. It is 2 volumes. In English, both volumes will appear in one book. In Korean is translated now the first volume, which is a commentary to chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Capital.
Okay.
And just this morning, the translator, Won-tae Kim, sent me a mail that this book is on sale now for the first day today.
Okay.
So you can check it in Korean language, what I did and what I didn't do.
Today's your presentation, diachronic and synchronic dimension. Is that one of or part of content in any other your research articles?
Not so clearly, not so to the point than I did this today. It's I was occupied with these themes also the end of the last year. In October, I had a talk at Yale University about value theory, and there I spoke about historiography of value theory.
Okay.
And this, what I told you today, is in some respect a continuation of this first presentation, and maybe when I find the time, I would write an article about this. However, as it was said in the introduction of my person, I'm now working on this 4-volume biography of Marx and evolution of his work. And this task revealed to be much bigger than I expected when I started years ago. So I don't know if I will really find the time now to write another article about this diachronic and synchronic dimension.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope to read you any new or any concise your research article on this matter today, topic diachronic and synchronic dimensions related to Marx's works, to understand better under your presentation you did today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. All question is finished. So, Hyun-Kang, Professor Hyun-Kang, can you finish our?
We had, I think, one Marcel gave sign. He wanted to say something.
Oh, okay. Marcel.
I think I had 2 comments I just wanted to add. One is on the questions of the truth. To me, it's the fact that Marx takes such pains to finish any kind of writing and actually publishes so little of it. It seems to suggest to me that the things that he did publish, such as the first volume of Capital, he probably did have a rather high opinion of. So I suspect that he probably, at least at the point when he finally completed them for publication, he probably did think that this was the truth, although later maybe he would change his mind. Different from all the trillions of drafts and excerpts and notes, etc., which are certainly not the truth, but they are sort of stepping stones on the path to actually producing something that he considered publishable. So he had obviously extremely high standards for what he would let out into the world, and I suspect he would assume that this has a very high approximation to the truth. This is the one comment where I would perhaps slightly differ from your presentation. And the other question is that of the determinism. So I have a slight feeling that you turn Marx a bit too much into a scholar, which is obviously one part of what he was. But if I think about the earlier Marx, so Marx before 63 or whatever the kind of turning point would presumably be, the man was spending an awful lot of time on revolutionary activities. So if he was a determinist of any sort at any point in his life, would he have spent so much time for activities that are not only very time consuming and distracting from his scholarly activity, but also thoroughly illegal, unhealthy, and dangerous? So that suggests to me again that he was at no point a determinist, because a determinist doesn't engage in conspiratorial working class organizing and that kind of thing. Why would you do that if you are a determinist?
This is an interesting point. But the determinism in Marx was not the kind, the revolution will come and will have a big victory. Of course, with such a view, you could just sit in your armchair and drink a good glass of wine, waiting for the coming revolution. What he thought is that necessarily the contradictions will get more intensive, and a revolutionary situation will necessarily come, and then it depends on the activity. So,
but that is a very weak form of determinism. I'm not sure I would call that determinism.
Pardon? Could you repeat?
I'm not sure I would call that determinism, so that might be misunderstood, because most people would call determinism something much stronger than that.
No, I think you can call it determinism, because Marx, for example, in Communist Manifesto, very clearly stated there will come this revolution. There was not any doubt of it. So this is a clearly determinist statement. I know what will happen in the future, but that the outcome is in my favor, this is not clear. Therefore, we need revolutionary organization, revolutionary activity. And the other point I want to stress, you are right that Marx was on the one hand very active, but when you look at his life as a whole, you have periods of very big activity, and then you have periods with nearly no political activity where he just was studying. And also here, then you can say, when he was so much a revolutionary who think, oh, I can move the things, why he was studying so much. So I would say the case is a little bit more complicated in Marx. It is not a determinist who is doing nothing, or a revolutionary who is doing nothing than revolution. It's more complicated. But I also want to touch your first question, what Marx published, that he trusted there so much. When you see the history, the conditions, when he published, under which conditions, so often he was more or less forced to publish. As well, Friedrich Engels as Wilhelm Liebknecht for years pressed him, you have to publish first volume of Capital. Marx wrote to them, I cannot publish the first volume. I must see first the whole work as a draft in front of me, then I can start this publication. But they pressed him again and again, and so he accepted in 1866, I will do a manuscript. And in order to finish the manuscript, he even left chapters out. So it is not at all perfect what he did, and he knows this very well, but he agreed to what Engels said, it is better to publish now something which is not perfect than to have something perfect in your desk which will never appear. So also here I would say it is a little bit more complicated. Often he published things, he also knew that there was a luck, but he saw a political necessity. For example, when he published his famous civil war in France about the Paris Commune, he didn't think the analysis is ready. He thought it's political necessary to intervene with such a book. I think he was very critical against himself in all stages, publishing or not publishing things.
that publication is also a kind of intervention and a kind of activity. If you don't publish anything, you can't move. But if you publish, you can move some discussion, some movement, some kind of activities and practices. Therefore, this is also very, very important to publish.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Is
for
there any
Marx,
other?
it was always a problem. He wanted to publish something what is really good, but this needs time. But it was necessary to bring out now something. And sometimes he decided, I publish. And sometimes he decided, no, not at all. The world has to wait.
But this is, of course, especially true of the manifesto that you quoted as evidence for his determinism, which, as the name suggests, is very much an intervention. So if he says in the manifesto, the revolution is coming, that is a form of pep talk. That is not a scholarly statement, as is evidence in the nature of the text, what kind of text it is. So it is a manifesto that was meant to intervene, actually didn't intervene terribly much, if I know that correctly. But the intention of saying that our revolution is coming, I've written pamphlets like that. I didn't necessarily believe that was true, but that is a performative act, if you like.
I totally agree with this point. Manifesto is not a scientific work. It is a political pamphlet, and we have to see this. This is in my with my wording. You have to see the synchronic dimension of manifesto. It's an intervention, and in so far, I wouldn't rest my judgment that Marx had deterministic views. I wouldn't rest it only on the manifesto. There are also articles, other articles, where this determinism also appears. And so I would say there is a strong tendency, but the tendency in the life of Marx becomes less and less strong. And in the 1870s, he has a clear point against determinism. And so clear how he was in the 1870s, he was not in the 40s or 50s.
Very much. I see no other question. Is it okay to finish the discussion now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for your great talk and for the very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you very much for the questions. And it was also a nice talk for me. I also learned something.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, all the participants. Okay, we can finish now. So, thank you.
Thank you.